Thank you for checking out my channel. Please like and subscribe. Leave me a comment down below. This is a nuclear war simulation. Cuban Missile Crisis goes hot. I'm going to give you a very quick, very knuckle-dragger, high-level version of the Cuban Missile Crisis for those of you that are unaware. In 1962, the Soviets decided to deploy nuclear weapons on Cuba. You can debate the reasons why, but one of them was that we had forward deployed missiles in Turkey. So the Soviet Union at the time, which when we look at the nuclear order of battle, you'll see that they didn't have a lot of weapons that could actually strike the United States. So they forward deployed these weapons. We found out about it doing overflights with U-2 spy planes. We didn't like it. Told them no way. Historically speaking, diplomacy won out, and a lot of people lived that wouldn't have otherwise. This alternate history is going to look at the event that took place on October 27th when the Soviet Foxtrot-class sub, the B-59, which was patrolling off the coast of Cuba and was armed with a single 15-kiloton nuclear torpedo, was tracked and surrounded by 3 U.S. destroyers. Those destroyers started dropping practice depth charges in an attempt to get the sub to surface to be able to talk to it. The sub was out of communication, was not able to communicate with their command. They weren't aware of what was going on, and they thought there was a possibility that World War III had broken out. And so they wanted to fire the nuclear-tipped torpedo. There's 3 people on that sub that could help make that decision. Commander of the boat, political commissar, and the commander of the flotilla. Commander of the flotilla happened to be on that boat, so it took all 3 of them to agree unanimously. Historically speaking, one of them did not, 2 of them did, so they didn't fire. In this alternate take, all 3 are going to agree. They fire the nuclear-tipped torpedo, 15-kiloton warhead, and as such that it ends up destroying the 3 U.S. destroyers and sinking them. Also, the massive shock wave breached its own hull and caused it to sink. So, a lot of chaos after that event. Before we go any further, let's take a look at the nuclear order of battle. Just want to say there's some caveats here. This is a subtotal. Some of this stuff wasn't actually available. For instance, the Soviet nuclear ballistic missile subs, all of them were in port getting overhauled due to the K-19 disaster. If you're unfamiliar with that, check out the K-19 Widowmaker movie with Harrison Ford and Liam Neeson. It's like Chernobyl, but on a sub. And so there's some other nuances there that's factored in. But let's take a look at it and get an idea of the nuclear forces available to each side. The nuclear order of battle. I got this from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist. This is their report on the nuclear order of battle from October and November of 1962. It's not necessarily all-inclusive, but it was a good starting point to then base what forces were available to each side, or in this case, a few sides. They have this broken down into local forces in and around Cuba, regional forces in Europe, and then also global strategic forces. One thing that becomes readily apparent, there's a big disparity in favor of the United States against the Soviet Union when it comes to the number of warheads and bombs available. Theater level in Europe, it's a little more even. On the side of air assets and ICBMs, and also sub-launched, it is heavily weighted in favor of the United States. And again, like I said, this isn't necessarily all-inclusive. They didn't have a breakdown of what, gravity bombs were available for the respective air forces. They also didn't talk about actual warhead yield size, accuracy, range, all those sort of things. So I had to do a lot of digging to come up with it, and I kind of threw it into a spreadsheet. So here I broke it down with actual warheads, the range, accuracy, yield, and some other notes, just like the land attack cruise missiles that were available to the Soviet forces on Cuba. Those only had a range of about 150 kilometers, just like the Frog short-range ballistic missile was 65 kilometers. They did not have range to hit the United States, even in Florida, but they were to be used for coastal defense in case the United States attempted any type of landing. And so again, you see here, when it comes to the total yield, total number of warheads, heavily weighted to the United States. And there's some other aspects too on the Soviet side. For instance, like the SS-6 missiles, there were 6, but those took over 20 hours to prepare. And during the crisis, only one warhead was actually deployed, because they can only keep those deployed for so long before they cause deterioration of the warhead. And so the SS-7 was able to be deployed much faster, but none of them are deployed to the speed of the U.S. forces. This is what was available on the European theater side. Again, it's a little more even on this side, but the United States does still have the favor when it comes to strategic bombing. So this is going to be the basis, and I do factor in if there was known percentages of launch failures, like you'd see with the intermediate range Thor missile, had a 24% launch failure. Similar to the Russian and Soviet sub-launched missiles. After some emergency meetings, Kennedy tells the U.S. Navy to sink any Soviet sub in the Western Atlantic. They end up sinking 2 more and use nuclear depth charges on one of them. So both sides in day one have used some limited nuclear weapons. None of this is on land yet, but as the evening progresses, a lot of calls back and forth, a lot of heated conversations. Kennedy authorizes a large airstrike package on Cuba to eliminate their SAM sites, Soviet surface-to-air missile sites, and also the medium-range ballistic missile sites. Hoping to keep this from escalating any further, Kennedy does not authorize nuclear weapons to be used on these airstrikes, but conventional. He's also pressured to authorize Operational Plan 316, which would be the U.S. invasion of Cuba, using the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions and the 1st, 2nd Marine Divisions. He does not authorize this, but he does have them start staging to be ready within 5 days. So one of the things that does happen, though, as word spreads about the naval engagement and then the bombings that are taking place on Cuba, is the fact that along the east-west divide in Europe, troops on both sides are really kind of getting a furor, and they actually start taking pot shots at each other. Throughout the night, this escalates into full-scale fighting. So it's one of those things, rather than one side giving the order versus the other side, it kind of happens organically. Everyone thinks the other side started shooting first. Truth is, it's probably just a bunch of drunks started taking pot shots at each other, and now, unfortunately, tanks are blasting, artillery is blasting. Again, overnight it's still remaining conventional, but we're going to lead into the daytime. And with that, take a quick look at this video. So on day 2, the Soviet army starts slowly pushing back NATO forces. After the 8th Guards Army made a breakthrough across the Fulda Gap, U.S. Army commanders request the use of battlefield nuclear weapons, and they are granted it. So they start shooting off some very low-yield, 20-ton warhead-sized Davy Crockett. These are kind of like the handheld weapons. If you've seen the Starship Troopers movie and, they fire that shoulder-fired nuke, think of it like that. So we're going to see some explosions just kind of across the front line here. And, really, this was about breaking up the Soviet formations. The NATO forces, NATO countries had decided kind of early on they didn't want to try to match the sheer number of troops that the Warsaw Pact and Soviet forces were deploying. It was very expensive to do so. So they were going to make up for that gap by using these little low-yield nukes. And so, believe it or not, as crazy as it sounds, that was the strategy. And so, you see here, just being fired off, just, it's not particular to a location, it's just representing some explosions going on. where they're trying to break up the formations as they advance, really along that east-west divide. So this is going to follow on with some larger strikes, air gravity bombs. These would be from U.S. fighters and bombers, 160 kiloton warheads. These are going to be airburst at a 200-meter height. And again, this is to break up some of the larger divisional forces. And again, what they're trying to do is they're trying to keep the fighting outside the city, and they're trying to keep the nukes outside the city. So some of them are close by, and unfortunately, these are much larger yield warhead sides. So you see here, and of course, the Soviets are going to start firing their own missiles as well, for largely the same reason, as a lot of their infantry formations and armored formations are being destroyed or being dispersed. They're going to start targeting NATO formations. Again, not really targeting cities or anything supply chains. This is mostly to achieve battlefield success versus strategic success. It will change quickly, though. So now we're going to look at the Russians. They're using a 30 kiloton gravity bomb, also detonating at 200 meters. These are going to be striking a little closer to the cities because this is where the NATO forces are going to be a little closer to as they're getting it pushed back. So we'll take a quick look. Let's see here. So we're going to look at some casualties real fast. One thing that you got to keep in mind when it comes to the casualties, these are 2020 numbers. I have a spreadsheet that I'm going to look at towards the end, and I'll show everybody that's going to take a percentage based on 1962 population levels. So this will be adjusted at the end, but 2020 levels, 181,000 Germans would be dead at this point. This isn't going to factor in troops too. I mean, that would take an enormous amount of time to put that casualties towards that, and the casualties are going to raise to such a level that it's really not going to be a factor. So on the Cuban front, what's going to happen is earlier in the day, there was a final Soviet sub, and it was being trailed by a U.S. carrier along with a fleet of 6 destroyers. That sub fired its 15 kiloton nuclear warhead, and it destroyed the carrier along with 2 of the destroyers. Several thousand sailors dead. Kennedy authorizes a 12 kiloton gravity bomb to be airburst over Santa Clara. And this is really a message to Castro. You need to surrender now, or this is going to escalate much, much higher. So Castro has been begging the Soviet field commander Palyov, whatever his name is, begging him for the use of nuclear weapons. The U.S. doesn't know it, but the Soviets have these land attack cruise missiles. They call them Frog for short. They're 2 kiloton yield warhead size. They don't have the range to hit the United States, but they can be used on Cuba in the battlefield. And so the Soviets refuse. Late that night, after the bomb is detonated over Santa Clara, Castro orders some Cuban troops to commandeer 10 of these Frog missiles. So they do so. Well, they're able to get 8. One of them they miss and hit the sea. Another one, they go off target and actually hit some of their own Cuban army positions surrounding Guantanamo Bay base. The other 6 hit the base itself. So the Marines stationed there are now getting hit with 2 kiloton warheads, 6 of them total, and it basically destroys them as a fighting force at that point. They, the survivors, there's going to be radiation sickness, there's going to be all kinds of problems there. And they had been holding out against the Cubans, but at this point they ceased to be a fighting force, the garrison there in Guantanamo Bay. Casualties in Cuba are rising at this point as well. Not to mention Santa Clara and this. So, in the early morning hours of day 3, the escalation ladder climbs again. After the attack on Guantanamo Bay with nuclear weapons, Kennedy authorizes a 1 megaton bomb to be detonated 550 meters above Havana. And this is to decapitate the Cuban government. This would include Fidel Castro. His bunker collapses under the force of this nuclear explosion. Likewise, they also hit the remaining medium-range ballistic missile sites. There were still 4 of them operational after the conventional bombings, with 160 kiloton warheads. This succeeds in destroying 2 of the 4 remaining, and the other 2 were positioned in caves and did survive the bombings. Those remain to be the only weapons stationed on Cuba that are effective at actually striking the United States. So the European theater is going to expand. So far, most of the fighting has taken place on the central plains of Germany, but now we're going to see that the Soviet Union has started targeting Turkey and some of the ballistic missile sites, but also some Turkish cities. And so Turkey, along with the U.S. Army, retaliate, firing the Jupiter missiles stationed there at Soviet sites. So we're going to get into a little bit of a tit-for-tat type of situation. So the Soviets are using the SS-4s primarily, which is a 1 megaton warhead, 2.4 kilometer accuracy range. So they're going to hit a few locations, some of them military, some of them cities, and then we're going to switch and show the strikes coming from the Turkish side. So again, this is some of the military stuff along the border. We're also going to hit some of the larger cities. But again, accuracy is an issue. In fact, some of them actually just detonate into the sea because of it. And not all of them are actually going to launch, for that matter. So for example, I know when we looked at the weapons position in Turkey, there was approximately 15 1.44 megaton Jupiter missiles. Not all of those are going to launch when we go to the other side. A lot of them will. So again, these targets, it's not a ton of time put into it. It's just trying to give a broad stroke. I mean, we're talking thousands of warheads here, so I had to, I say wing it, but just say that it's to give a broad overview. So we're going to see the same thing now from the Turkish side. They're going to start detonating. They're going to be hitting a lot of the satellite republics that would break away after the fall of the Soviet Union. So we're looking at Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. It's awful because, I love the wilderness cooking shows that all seem to be like coming out of Azerbaijan. I swear they got the market cornered on YouTube for these wilderness cooking shows. But it's great stuff. Looks like a beautiful place to live, to be honest with you. So it wouldn't be after it got nuked, but thankfully it didn't. It looks like a beautiful place to live. So they're going to strike as far away, Crimea. So again, just trying to find a mix of targets. Don't want to leave anybody out. They're not going to target Iran. Iran at this time was a U.S. ally. So, let's see here. So we're going to move to the European theater now. I mean, it's European, Central Asia, but more European proper. And the warhead sizes are going to get higher. And what we're going to see is now some more targeting more of some cities versus just attempting to take out military formations. So cities, air bases, all that good stuff. These are going to be SS-4s, so 1 megaton warhead size. Starting to hit a lot of the major German cities. Right now, they're still not targeting the United Kingdom. They're not targeting France. And they haven't directly targeted U.S. mainland. On the flip side, outside of Turkey, they have not targeted the actual USSR. Turkey, or the U.S. forces in Turkey, did target actually USSR proper. So far in Europe, they've only targeted some of the Warsaw Pact states, the non-USSR ones. Of course, that's going to change too. It's going to change very rapidly here. We're only really in the middle of day 3 right now. Now, one thing, as they've targeted some of these air bases, some of these military bases, NATO's already dispersed its forces. During the second day, they'd start dispersing their forces, their nuclear missiles, as best they could. So a lot of these are largely ineffective in eliminating the NATO's ability to, have their own nuclear forces. See, I was considering UK right there, but then I held off because I remembered that we're not going to be striking during day 3. This is the SS-5 missile. So this has a 2.3 megaton warhead. It's more accurate, more devastating. So. So we're going to skip forward a little bit. There's going to be a lot of targeting, but, I don't want to bore people to death. So there's going to be some more targeting on both the Soviet and NATO sides where they're going to be striking cities. Again, it's going to avoid France, UK, and USSR, but we're going to have Poland and other places hit. So we'll go forward a little bit. All right, as you can see, smoke clouds are rising very high. Kind of skipping past to the end of the day here. So I'm going to take a quick look at the casualty rates towards the end of day 3. Again, these are non-adjusted rates. So bear with that. But already you can see that casualties are now into the millions. Germany, Netherlands, Turkey, Georgia. So represents. Now we're looking at, casualty rates will be approaching like World War I levels. Even potentially higher, in the World War II at this point. And we're 3 days into the conflict at this point. So let's go ahead and let's move on, though, to day 4. So day 4, landings from U.S. troops actually start happening after some bombardments from the U.S. Navy. There is 4 landing locations. At this point, the Cubans have started commandeering weapons from the Soviets, killed the Soviet field commander, and they're going to start using these frog missiles against the landing sites. So they commandeered 20 frog missiles, and they're going to start bombarding these airfields and other locations where the U.S. military is not forward stage, where they've landed or jumped in. So let's see it. I pre-placed the kind of positions here, and so this is all based on that Operation 316, where they would have landed had they been given the order. And each side's getting hit with 5 of those 2 kiloton warheads. And also, alongside these Frog missiles, they also capture those 2 surviving medium-range ballistic missiles, the SS-4s. So, they have 2 of those. They try to fire 2 of them. One of them fires and goes up and explodes shortly afterwards. The other one continues on towards its target, which they had set to target Miami. So we're talking it's going to be a 2.3 megaton warhead, 5.16 kilometer accuracy. So let's see here. So now we have detonated a 2.3 megaton warhead over a U.S. city. And so this changes the dynamic rapidly. And by late afternoon, Kennedy has authorized PSYOP 63, a full nuclear attack against the USSR and Cuba. So, and likewise, Soviet Union, after learning of the bomb detonation, is going to authorize the same. So you're going to see here, kind of sped things up very quickly. We have strikes going on, and there's just going to be a ton of them. So on both the U.S. and Soviet side. So these are the Soviet ICBMs. They've targeted 18 locations, a mix of strategic Air Force base locations, Omaha, Cheyenne Mountain Complex, Washington, D.C., New York City, Long Beach, and Detroit, a few other locations. There are so many on the Soviet side. The U.S. had over almost 3,000 nuclear gravity bombs. So as I was going through this, I only used about half of what the U.S. arsenal was. We're talking about overkill. I mean, it was just crazy as I just kept like going through and going through. I mean, you can hear the explosion, just boom, 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 boom. And we have a mix of ICBMs and air ones. We do have some Russian strikes or Soviet strikes on Alaska. Crap out of Cuba. And so let's take a look now at the casualties. And I'm gonna bring up my spreadsheet because it's going to look at losses as they are based on 1962 numbers. And looking at the percentage of the total population. So let's take a look at that, looking at the fallout right now. And now I'll put this on a full screen so you can see, and we'll run through it real fast. All right, let's look at the casualties here. So this is at the end of day 4. Massive nuclear strikes have happened. At this point, there's a temporary peace. The Soviet Union no longer exists in any fashion at this point. So let's take a look at it. And so this is what the 2020 numbers were on this column here. And this would be adjusted for 1962 population levels. There's the actual population in 1962. And the final one's going to look at, okay, this is the percentage of loss. So not every country really has a large representation here, but let's pick out some of the big ones. Almost 9.7 million U.S. casualties, close to 100,000 Canadian, almost 2.2 million on the Cuban side, 12.2 on the Polish side, 40.6% of their population, 29% of the Cuban population. Comparatively, it's about 5% of the U.S. population. Let's look at all the big ones here. Hungary, We're looking at 2.5 million, 57.4% of their population. Finland didn't have a lot. It's mostly from fallout from Russia, but 77,000. Let's look at Latvia, 1.2 million, 58%. Lithuania, 1.5, 55%. Belarus, 5 million, almost 60%. I think they have the highest percentage they do. No, I'm sorry, Georgia has the highest percentage. Georgia, 68% of their population dead. 2.9 million losses. Tajikistan, 17.2%. Russia itself, almost 41% of the population. 50.3 million losses. All total, factored in for 1962, and this is just immediate aftermath. This isn't counting people who died because of lack of supplies. Doesn't count any of that other stuff. This is just immediate casualties. 151 million people. 9% of the world's population gone in 4 days. 9%. Might as well say 10% of the population gone in 4 days. So, whereas we think in 1962, the stockpile of missiles and everything, the stockpile of bombs, was not nearly as high as it would be like in 1985, where they reached their zenith. Still, just the massive amount of destructive capability there. So had the Cuban Missile Crisis gone hot, had it involved into strategic levels, the amount of loss of life would have been huge. 10% of the world's population done. Who knows how many people here today wouldn't just be here today. Wiped out completely because their parents, grandparents, dead. Couldn't even have you. Nothing, even 5% of the population. You think about the loss of 5% of your population for the United States. It'd be huge. You're talking industrial centers. Detroit. At the time, Detroit still had a market share of the automotive industry. New York, Manhattan, financial districts, Long Beach, the port. All those different things gone. And that's not even counting the Soviet side. Like I said, the Soviet Union at that point doesn't even cease. It's gone. It doesn't exist anymore. You've lost over 50% of your population. You're going to cease to exist as a country. So, just a stark reminder. Cuban Missile Crisis, if it went hot and was not kept in check, it would have made World War I and II look like a walk in the park, comparatively. Casualty-wise, in the time frame, in the daily, in a 4-day time frame, several hundred, you could argue with losses in World War II and stuff, but still, the time frame was where you're going to see it. And then long-term casualties would rise from there. I would imagine you'd see something into the billion range by the time you factored in people who had what would be otherwise survivable injuries but didn't have medical care that would die. Loss of food, starving to death, all those sort of things. So, appreciate you joining me for this video. Please give me a like. Please give me a subscription. I have more content coming on the way. Thanks, everybody.